Join me in welcoming Alex Capri.
It's a real pleasure to be able to kick this off and to start discussing the topic that I'm going to bring out here, and that is the perfect storm. Before I get to that, let me tell you how and why I am where I am now. And I'm really a conflicted guy, right? When it comes to globalization, when it comes to cross-border trade. I mean, that's been my bread and butter, right? I am a child of the Pax Americana. My dad was a career U.S. diplomat. I grew up in 9 different countries, moved every couple of years. I grew up an internationalist, right? And I grew up steeped in the belief of the virtues and the benefits of global trade. My grandparents on my mother's side were 3-generation shippers, a shipping company, and they had business all over the place. So I am a believer in international trade. I'm a believer in cross-border commerce. That was what I studied in college. I started my career with the U.S. Customs Service, dealing with imports and exports out of the United States, free trade agreements. I came on right around the time Steve Olson, who you'll hear next, was at the U.S. Trade Rep Office, the USTR. I was at Customs, working on NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which that went a different way. We won't go there yet. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today is really the most consequential changes that we've seen to the international system really, truly since the Second World War. Okay? We are going through historic change, and I don't think a lot of people have really come to fully grasp the scale of that. I don't think people in the corporate world, these are people, I should add that I spent 20 years as a consultant, mostly as a partner at KPMG and PwC, and that was all out here in Asia. And I spent my career building global supply chains, mostly into China, right? Linking the world to China and Southeast Asia, but mostly to China, right? So this China-centric model of offshoring and not just globalization, but hyper-globalization. That's been really good to a lot of people. But this is all changing now. This is fundamentally changing. So globalization as we've known it, hyper-globalization as we've known it, is over. It's finished. It's done. It's not coming back. Okay? That doesn't mean globalization has finished. It doesn't mean that there's no more globalization. What it means is that the nature of globalization has changed. And as we will discuss today, it's more of a landscape of glocalization, right? A fracturing landscape, a landscape where long extended, hyper extended global value chains are balkanizing. They're fracturing, they're localizing, they're regionalizing. And frankly, if you factor in geopolitical risk, if you factor in carbon footprints and climate change, and if you factor in risks to single source supply chains because of a pandemic or the next pandemic, when that happens, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, it's time to restructure global value chains. And it's time to move them as local as possible. And frankly, if you can make local and buy local, then produce local. Do it locally. You'll save the environment and you'll gain all those other benefits as well. And you know what? I don't think that is such a bad scenario. We're still going to see an explosion of international digital trade as people try to leverage and commoditize data and services. And of course, there will be essential trade in goods. And I'll talk to you about the striated levels of trade that I see coming. A split 3-level type of trading system with 3 different sort of zones or areas, right? So we'll talk about that as well. I'm not going to get through all of this because we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to hit the high points. And I'm calling this the perfect storm because the convergence, the confluence of geopolitics, climate change, and the pandemic have produced the situation that we're in. And what it has essentially done is it has accelerated these changes that I've mentioned around fragmentation in general. And that means other things change along with that as well. It means that we're grappling right now for new rule frameworks, right? We're grappling for new standards. We're grappling for new sort of harmonization, if you will, of application of behaviors, right? And how is that all going to shake out, right? How is that going to play out? Does that mean that certain countries will coalesce around a certain set of standards, right? And others will, again, not join that group? What are we seeing? The big story here is, everything I'm describing to you, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. So again, think of this, when I talk about China and I talk about restructuring and decoupling, et cetera, think of this as a really, really complicated divorce with lots of kids, right? With tons of offspring, right? And they've been going at it for 3 decades, right? So there's just offspring everywhere. And some of them are favorite offspring and some of them are less favorite. Some of them are evil children and some of them are beloved, right? So it's hard. How do you sort all that out? That's the situation right now that we have with China, okay? And I'll get back to that. Plenty to read about. I'm very fortunate and grateful to the Hinrich Foundation. I've written a lot on this topic, and the foundation has published it, and that's all available to you. This is perfect because we're in a room full of media, but look at the headlines. Just take a minute to check out the headlines. China-free supply chains. I'm going to talk a lot about semiconductors today, sort of a case in point, because semiconductors are really essentially a public good, right? You have energy, you have food, and now you have semiconductors, right? You simply can't live without any of those in a modern world. So we'll talk about that. But this is affecting a lot of things, which we'll get into. And some of you may even have contributed to these headlines, right? Some of you may even have maybe written some of these headlines, I don't know. Okay? But it's affecting people. It's affecting physical supply chains. It's affecting data. It's affecting the platform economy. It's affecting, and this is what we haven't heard a lot about, and this is an area that I think is really, really ripe for upheaval, and that's global financial markets. Global financial markets in an era of sanctions, global financial markets in an era of the weaponization of currencies, such as the U.S. dollar. If you were China, wouldn't you want to develop your own currency so that every time the Americans get mad at you, they can't weaponize the US dollar? Well, that's exactly what they're doing, right? They're speeding ahead and they're looking to roll out the central bank-backed digital renminbi. Now that opens up another can of worms around, data and data privacy, and again, balkanization around standards when it comes to data and money. So I think the financial sector is really the next sector to be shaken up, and I think Wall Street's about ready to have a big branch drop on top of them as well. Seriously. And I'll talk about the paradoxes, okay? In fact, okay, that's the perfect storm. Okay, I even changed the title of this slide. I used to just call it the paradigm shift and talk about the paradigm shift. Now I'm calling it the paradigm shift and the paradox, because the paradigm shift is producing paradoxes everywhere, right? That's that 30-year marriage, that messy, fruitful, productive marriage. It's full of paradoxes now, all right? Economically, and I'm starting to really feast off of this. I'm really starting to enjoy this, especially with a lot of my old academic colleagues, and that is, there is a debate, there's a raging debate right now between the liberal classical economists, right? And the dogma is no government involvement, let the markets rule. Capital is most efficient when markets push it and allocate it into its most efficient, productive state. We've seen 30 years of that. You look at supply chains in automotive, in pharmaceutical, in even agriculture, right? We've got massive industrialized agriculture with agritech, right, and agrochemical companies and monocrops. And you know what? It evolved that way because it's the most transactionally efficient. Transactional costs are low when economies of scale are big, right? And as we go through this so-called third unbundling that Richard Baldwin talks about, where the cost of communication drops, the cost of logistics drops, AI is more powerful, connectivity is more powerful, it makes total sense to have these massive supply chains. And the name of the game is offshoring. Offshore, offshore, offshore. I can remember 15 years ago, 10 years ago, sitting in corporate boardrooms and the topic of, okay, what's our growth strategy for next year? What's our growth strategy? I kid you not. One word. Anybody? One word. Huh? Offshore, that's good. China. Seriously, what's our growth strategy for next year? China. Done. Seriously. How do you change that culture? We've had 30 years of this. We've had 30 years of economies of scale, right? Manufacturing base, okay, we moved up the value chain, and now we've moved from cheap, stuff to really sophisticated stuff that's getting made in China because basically multinationals have made it so, right? They've shifted everything there, and it's taken 30 years, and we've seen the largest, swiftest transfer of wealth in human history, and that's technology, right? Technology enabled that. Technology lowered barriers. It was very inexpensive. You could do all that stuff at scale, and of course, AI and connectivity. Computer power, connectivity, and so on and so forth. So laissez-faire saw the rise of a new superpower, but it wasn't adhering to the same rules and the same standards. It was a state-centric, mercantilist country, and it essentially has upended the international system. And of course, with the geopolitics involved, we're now witnessing this whole scenario of backlash and restructuring and so forth. So the laissez-faire camp is now confronted with a very pervasive managed trade mindset, meaning that governments intervene in markets. Governments choose favorites, they choose national champions. Governments protect favorite companies. Governments promote national mercantilist policies, which we'll talk about. Governments protect markets, they close off markets. They do all of this, and a focus has been on technology. Hence the term that I've been using a lot, and that's techno-nationalism. So laissez-faire has moved to a new kind of nationalism. And of course, you've been hearing a lot with the Ukraine war about food security and about energy security. And that was actually the title of my last paper here was about food security. The other thing that's changed in this paradigm shift, and again, this is, I would argue, and I don't know how Steve feels about this, but Steve's got wonderful, wonderful insights, and I'm sure you've been reading his stuff. But I would argue that the last 70 years of the international system have been a historic anomaly. I think if you go back, let's go all the way back to the Dutch East Indies Company. Let's go back, 300, 400, 500 years, whatever. My dates are not good. It's been a long time. How many years has it been? How many decades has it been? Centuries, rather. There's been a feedback loop, right? There has been a constant feedback loop that involves economic power, right? Economic wealth linked to national security or military prowess, which is, of course, linked to technology, which then forms this ever-evolving, ever-present feedback loop. It just goes round and round, okay? Now, if we go back to the Second World War and the Bretton Woods system and the post-World War II era, you had a unique situation where the United States essentially emerged as the chief architect, the United States along with its allies, the UK and many of the countries that are the G7 today, eventually the G7. They essentially built a system where, interestingly, security institutions were separate from economic institutions. We had the World Bank, right? We had the International Monetary Fund. We had these multilateral development banks. And then when it came to security, we had completely separate institutions like NATO, right? You didn't see them intertwining. But now, if you read NATO's mission statement, what are they doing? You have a security organization that is completely rewriting what it's doing. It's getting into the business of AI. It's getting into the business of cybersecurity. It's getting into the business of linking, it's getting into the business of R&D and linking developments of new technologies to security. So that bifurcation that we used to see is no longer happening. Now that is more of a mercantilist. If you then factor in all of the if you factor in all of the other economic activity that is emerging, which I'll get into shortly, that is a paradigm shift. That's a major paradigm shift. Okay. I think the other thing to take away from this is, in a laissez-faire system, large multinationals pretty much had the run of things. They could pretty much do stuff relatively uninterrupted. They'd get shaken down in sort of antitrust measures occasionally, but nobody's really going to tell Coca-Cola how to run their business around the world, and nobody's really told Intel or Qualcomm until recently where they can move their business and who they can sell their stuff to. But that's all changed now. So what we see in terms of this paradox is there is a new tension that has emerged between state and non-state actors that is going to play out. And that's something that you should be covering and paying very close attention to going forward, because now we have a situation where state actors are between a rock and a hard place, right? Take HSBC Bank in Hong Kong, right? They cooperated with the U.S. investigation against Huawei, which sent their CFO basically under house arrest in Canada for a couple of years because Huawei was selling sanctioned technology to North Korea and Iran. And HSBC cooperated with that investigation. And so the Chinese government came down really, really hard on HSBC, right? Well, we won't let you do this in our market. We won't let you do that. We won't let you do this. Look at my favorite airline, Cathay Pacific. Seriously. They're getting hammered. I don't know if Cathay Pacific is going to survive because their CEO came out and made some statements about the national security law, in Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. But go beyond that. When does a government look at a multinational as a strategic asset and say, you got to come work for us. We're co-opting you. You're building our cloud, right? You're building our rockets, SpaceX, Amazon, right? Whatever. Or if you're a Chinese company, the Communist Party has said, well, you can't do any of this stuff, and we're going to keep you on a really short leash, but you're building our blockchain, You're going to build our blockchain for our currency, our digital currency. You're going to build our surveillance systems for us. You're going to, you're going to help us double down on our dual circulation policy as we look to, manufacture everything at home, and so on and so forth. So how do you maneuver in a world like this, right, if you're a multinational company? And that's pretty complicated. In some cases, you decouple. In other cases, you say, okay, I'm just going to ring fence. I'm going to ring fence my entire China operations. I will source all my supplies. All my suppliers will be locally based, and I'll just produce for the Chinese market. And I'll have to do the same thing in India, and maybe I'll have to do the same thing somewhere else. Not very efficient, right? No economies of scale there. So here's a paradox. Here's one that you guys should be covering as well. I'd love to be reading more, and I know you guys do some really good work. And that is, you've been hearing and covering and writing a lot about decoupling, right? Strategic decoupling. Well, what is strategic decoupling? What does it mean? What exactly does strategic decoupling mean? It means that the word strategic is very important, right? It means that there's some kind of a critical asset, some kind of a critical commodity, such as rare earths, right? Critical minerals, pharmaceuticals. Now we're talking lithium batteries, of course semiconductors, right? Anything else? What else? Food, of course, and of course energy, right? Food and energy are two very, very critical supply chains that require strategic attention and strategic care. Okay, so it makes sense that if you're single sourcing or if you are overly reliant on any one single source, whether it's a so-called friendly country or even a rival, that you have to change that situation. At the very least, you have to diversify and you have to have redundancies, or you simply remove capabilities and you take it right out of the hands of your adversary. So we're seeing that happening now in rare earths. As the Aussies, the Americans, the Canadians, the Japanese team up, the Europeans team up, and we're seeing rapid development, I should say redevelopment of old rare earth mines that had closed and now are reopening and so on. We're seeing that. We're seeing that in the automotive sector, where supply chains become strategic and critical for any of those materials that go into batteries. We're seeing that restructuring. So the whole EV sector is balkanizing and fragmenting. And that's actually spilling over into clean tech as well. Because a lot of the core technologies are dual-use technologies, meaning that they are technologies that could become strategic at any day, and they could be used for military purposes. Okay, so that decoupling is happening strategically. So that's the first level, all right? I mentioned earlier that there were three, oh my gosh, we're moving quickly. There were three levels of supply chain that were basically striating, right? The first is that strategic level of all those commodities that I mentioned. If it's strategic, then we see, and we're going to continue to see, and forget about whether it's economically efficient or not. I was on a panel earlier this week with some economists, and one of these economists kept saying, "Oh, it's never going to happen because it's not economically efficient." And that is a perfect example of trying to shove a square peg in a round hole by continually trying to apply this classic liberal economic argument to supply chains. The primacy of geopolitics dictates that strategic areas must decouple and will decouple, or at the very least diversify and ring fence. And guess what? Prices are going to be higher, efficiencies are going to be lower, there's going to be labor challenges, all of that stuff. But guess what? Imagine if Taiwan had said that when they decided as an agrarian economy to transition to become what is now the hotbed of semiconductor manufacturing in the world. Seriously, Taiwan's economy in the 1970s was agriculturally based. oh, you can't do that. Well, yes, you can, because there was a geopolitical imperative. By the way, being the old guy that I am, I was in Taiwan in 1979. My father was stationed at the embassy there when the United States normalized relations with the People's Republic of China, and they closed the embassy and they kicked everybody out. They kicked out all the US diplomats because, right? And from that point onward, the people in Taiwan and policymakers in the United States said, okay, how do we secure Taiwan? How do we prevent Taiwan from being taken over forcibly? We industrialize it. We invest in it. And that's what we saw. And so the security and the geopolitical imperative led to a massive transformation of Taiwan's economy. And if you had said, oh, well, you know, it's not economically efficient, of course it isn't, but there's a higher imperative here, okay? So that's what we're going to see in that first band, in that first level, if you will, of the global supply chain. The next level is actually a much, much wider level, okay? And it's a gray zone. And in that gray zone, we have a lot of what I would call dual-use technologies, right? Which is pretty much any kind of technology today, that could potentially become subject to sanctions and export controls, depending on what happens in the world geopolitically. So you can have day-to-day trading, you can have large volumes of commerce and cross-border exchange happening, and it's fairly innocuous. Nobody really cares, right? Everything's good? Okay, I gotta move on. Okay. All right, I think I'll stop at slide 10. Okay, yeah, so that's pretty much, that's kind of a very, very, very high overview. Let me just spend 2 minutes flying through the rest of this, see if I want to stop on anything. So I think I've kind of defined techno-nationalism, and that is essentially where governments look at the prowess, their capabilities from a technological level, the innovation level, and they link that, their own homegrown companies, they link that to national security and economic security, and increasingly to social stability when we look at things like social media and e-commerce and social commerce and that type of thing. And this sort of hybrid warfare climate that we're in around that. So I think this is perfect. We'll just say, we'll stop it here, and we'll do data and other stuff another time. There really are, I see sort of a phased approach to techno-nationalism. The first is the weaponization of supply chains, which we've seen, right? You cut off the supply of a critical, vital technology or component by imposing sanctions. The next thing you do is you reshore, you ring fence, and you reshuffle, and you friend shore. You look for friendly confines, and there's some very interesting sort of divisions taking place in the G20 countries right now with the BRICS, involving the BRICS and the G7 countries and so forth. And there's a lot of sort of dynamics at play there. Then there's the innovation race. It's, I want to make my horse run faster than yours. And I've already taken care of making your horse run more slowly, right, in the first instance. But now I want to make my horse run faster. And I think that really is a very, very important emphasis. We're going to see more and more emphasis on that as time goes on. And then there's the techno-diplomacy aspect of it. That's where you're looking for new friends, you're looking for new partners, you're looking for new places to really get a jump start, right? To really jump start your innovation mercantilism and to really sort of secure your supply chain. So you're looking for new friends. So these are all major areas that you guys should be covering, right? You should be looking at the world in this context, in my opinion. Right? Okay. Okay, that's it. I'll stop there. Sorry, I had 60 slides. But anyway, okay.
How long do you think this whole phase of, being local, make local, how long is this going to last?
Well, it's not a phase. It's not a phase. We're not going back. We're not going back. And the reason we're not going to go back is because it's going to be so much more efficient. It's going to be, you know, the transactional costs are going to be so much lower when you can produce stuff locally, when you have the right kind of robotics, when you have the right kind of AI, when you have localized supply chains that, by the way, localized because carbon taxes are coming, right? So it's going to be more and more expensive to ship something across a border, especially if you're buying it from India, for example, right? If you're buying it from somewhere else, there will be other hindrances, there will be other obstacles to make it more expensive to ship all the way around the world. So carbon footprints will be another instance. So what the world is, we're really grappling right now with coming up with new institutions and new frameworks around digital trade, right? Digital trade, you know, and we saw the explosion of it because of the pandemic. Digital trade is going to produce more and more wealth. But the paradox is that as digital trade is exploding, so are localization rules. Data localization, right? Data security, data transfer rules, they're on the rise. So that's becoming more, it's making it more and more difficult. So that's the paradox. So when is this localization thing going to end? It isn't going to end because it's, you know, as the climate gets more harsh, as we see more really harsh weather, we see what's happening with food security now, with droughts all over the world. I mean, a place like Singapore, they are going to produce 30% of their food needs in vertical agriculture and hydroponics, you know, within the next 10 years. So circular economies, all of that sort of thing, it's just going to be more effective, more efficient, more profitable. It's going to drive a whole new ecosystem of tech startups and everything. Localization is great. It's great. It's going to produce a lot of wealth.
Just one more question as a follow-up to this. So where does the whole narrative of India being a protectionist economy fit in this narrative?
India is in a prime position right now geopolitically as a member of the Quad, right? It's lobbying hard to get semiconductor manufacturing done in India. It's decoupling actively from China. It's looking to localize, particularly around the telecommunications sector and handphones. It's doing all of that. And India is a real paradox because there are these nodes of very productive centers in India. But, you know, as one of my good Indian friends tells me, you know, India never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity because of its extensive red tape and bureaucracy and corruption, and it's got serious environmental problems. And yet, you have Taiwanese companies, Apple, Korean companies, moving big operations out there to hedge against China decoupling. It's happening. But India is an underachiever, and it's going to continue to be an underachiever.
For how long?
I will never get my hopes up about India. I mean, I say that, you know, in a purely economic and geopolitical sense. China is just so much more efficient and effective than India. And it's a real shame that we're having to go through this whole thing with China right now, that we're on this trajectory.
Thanks for chatting to us. We really appreciate it. So something that's been a real trend in Western elections in recent years has been we'll build things back home, we'll move things back home to be built, things like that. But while a country like China can obviously do that because it has a, you know, state-directed economy and it has enormous resources, it's a much harder thing for smaller Western countries. Like it was a major part of the recent Australian election. We'll build lithium batteries back in Australia. I mean, how realistic is this narrative that these sort of these high-tech manufacturing industries can just be sprung up in the next few years when they're facing competition from other, probably still far more efficient competitors around the world?
Yeah. Well, again, it depends on what level of the supply chain we're talking about. If it's super highly strategic stuff, then I think, actually, it's funny, I'm completing a work on this right now. And I think Australia is very uniquely positioned to go through a very, very unique moonshot. And I'll tell you why. One, I mean, okay, it's a small economy, it's far removed, all that kind of stuff. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Australia is part of some vital security networks with the United States. It's part of it's AUKUS, the Five Eyes, right? If you look at some of the university alliances that are emerging between Australian universities and American universities and so forth, through public-private partnerships, and I didn't get a chance to talk to you guys at all about that today, but I think the way of the future is public-private partnerships, okay? And that's how these less efficient, less market-driven, but geopolitically driven supply chains and ecosystems are going to get built through public-private partnerships. And Australia is uniquely positioned, right? Australia's got absolutely fantastic universities, got very, very capable government. It's got a great financial system. It's linked into a very important security network. It's got a very strong alliance with the United States. So I think Australia, we're going to see some very interesting things happening in Australia. You know, a country that everybody says, oh, they just do mining, all they just do, you know, they do agriculture. We're going to see some very interesting things. And stay tuned because I'll be presenting on that subject very soon. Okay?
Yes. Hello, I'm Hijin from Seoul, South Korea. I cover EV battery makers in South Korea. You know, they are doing localization. You know, they are building EV batteries next to the, like for example, like LG is building battery plants in the U.S. next to the GM's plant. Mm-hmm. But the problem is all the raw materials are coming from China because China is occupying a lot of mines around the world. So what they should do?
It's changing.
Yeah, but I talked to a trade ministry official recently, and then also talked to Samsung, and they say they're not prepared for anything if there's a war breaking in, Taiwan, so.
There's a consortium of Australian and American companies together with the Defense Department that are reopening the Mountain View mine in California, which is right on the border with Nevada, which used to be the world's largest rare earths operations, and it was shut down and offshored to China, right? So they're reopening that. They're doing stuff in Texas. They're doing in Australia. They're stepping up. Canada is doing stuff. So it's, you're looking at, to get a rare earth materials mine and processing operation going is a 10-year process, right? It's a 10-year process, but it's happening. The Japanese are sitting on top of perhaps one of the largest rare earth deposits in the Isagawara Islands, or what are they, right? Did I say that correctly? Nobody's heard of it. It's 1,000 kilometers. It's actually part of Tokyo. It's part of the Tokyo municipality. It's these islands out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Anyways, been wanting to go there for years. Better get there before they start mining, right, Steve? Anyway, all right. So all this stuff is happening, right? So it's going on. It's just, it's a process. Remember, most of us come from a culture, I come from a culture where, you can't see beyond the next quarterly statement, right? That's Western globalization is like, what's our plan next quarter? Growth at any cost, right? So of course, whereas, with companies like Samsung and the Korean, the Korean system, I would think that they'd be looking a little further ahead. And of course, Korea has announced massive infusions of money and capital to turn South Korea into a major technology hotbed, particularly with semiconductors. So that's all happening, right?
Hi. Are you calling for the demise of globalization? Is that what you're doing?
No.
Question. Economies of scale dictate that, obviously, as you said, these mines don't appear overnight, and certain places will never be able to produce these mines or these raw materials, etc. How on earth are they going to be able to withdraw from the globalization?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in a geopolitical strategic scenario, then you have to become self-reliant, right? China's entire policy on dual circulation is because they are so hopelessly reliant on foreign technology, particularly when it comes to semiconductors. They couldn't run their economy for a day if the US and its allies decided that they were going to just shut off the spigot, right? So they don't have a choice. Now, while they're still able to import and still benefit from globalization, of course, they're going to continue to do that, right? And even in a world where if you're selling and buying from your rival, which is, you see that in energy, right? The United States natural gas industry has signed billions of dollars of agreements with Chinese state-owned companies, right?
And you cannot do those local.
Well, the point is, the idea is if you can make money, but you can't do that if that is your single source of materials. Because the minute there's a conflict, you're going to lose that source of materials. The minute there's a pandemic, you're going to lose that source, right? So becoming self-sufficient is not necessarily synonymous with becoming totally decoupled, right? Does that make sense? I'll trade with Ben. I may have certain objections, and you and I may be, we may have certain geopolitical differences, but as long as you don't have the ability to just completely shut down my economy, right? We can still do business. And actually, we didn't have time to get into this today, but the whole game of in China for China, right? With you continue to do business with China as an American company. We're Qualcomm. Let's say we're Intel, right? Here's a great example. Here are two semiconductor companies that, NVIDIA and Intel, that make billions of dollars selling microchips to Chinese companies. Hikvision happens to be the world's largest maker of facial recognition cameras. SenseTime happens to make the AI for facial recognition. Those cameras are used by the Chinese government in Xinjiang province, for example, in Hong Kong, right? So what happened was sanctions were imposed, US sanctions were imposed, and those companies were no longer able to sell certain technology. There's another example here. Applied Materials and Lam Research, they make highly specialized manufacturing equipment for the semiconductor sector. When Huawei was placed on sanctions, right, the United States completely rewrote the export code in order to prevent TSMC from selling microchips to HiSilicon, which is a Huawei company, and that they therefore blocked not all technology, and this is the key, not all technology, but technology required for leading edge microchips, to make leading edge microchips. So here's how I would answer your question, Suling. Globalization is not over. Qualcomm and many other American companies are making billions of dollars, including Applied Materials and Lam Research. They are still selling technology to China. But in this case, it's for making semiconductors 10 nanometers and larger. That's 3 and 4 generation old technology. But China can't even do that without foreign technology. But where they've been totally explicitly barred from doing it is anything smaller than 10 nanometers, you need a license, and we're going to deny that license. So globalization is not over. Globalization is striated and it is fragmented. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, now, here's a story you should be watching, ladies and gentlemen, because there is now discussion going on in the United States to actually bar old technology to companies like SMIC, SMIC, and others, right? In other words, this is one of the paradoxes. If you look, SMIC has had their most profitable year ever, right? If you look at the numbers, investment is surging. Money is pouring into China, Well, then how can there be a decoupling? Is that a myth? Why is this happening? Well, there's a paradox. People are insulating themselves and they're getting ready to, they're girding themselves for an in China, for China market, right? Meaning that those trade supply lines are fragmenting and they're cutting, okay? So they're setting up, they're investing in new partnerships so that they have an insulated in China, for China thing. The other is, there's a lot of people freaking out thinking that even this older technology is going to be blocked, it's going to be barred. It's kind of like what Huawei did when they stockpiled semiconductors because they knew that they were going to be put on a sanctions list. So, and then when they burned through that pile of semiconductors, guess what? Now they can't even produce a phone that has 5G in it because they don't have access to the technology. So Huawei can't even service their old business model. They can't service their old 5G contracts all over the world. They can't get new ones, and they can't even service the old ones. But they're not out of business. They're migrating into niches. They're migrating into the automotive sector. They're partnering with EV companies. They're doing all that sort of thing. So globalization has been greatly disrupted, but globalization is not as a whole finished. And there's a lot of stuff that will continue to be exported unimpeded.
Well, it has to be because of the economies of scale across the world.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you're right, because prices will be way too high, which is what we're at
Right.
the moment.
Right. And unless governments can step in and alleviate those inefficiencies through subsidies, that's the only way that's going to happen. And that is exactly what's happening in the strategic sectors.
I'm curious, how would you assess China's response to this decoupling trend? Has the government taken measures to kind of slow down this process? Because it sounds like if decoupling, whether on a strategic level or not, can be quite detrimental to the Chinese economy in the long run. Has the government, what can China do?
Who started this whole decoupling thing in the first place? It was the Chinese government. China has been actively decoupling from the day they opened their borders, right? They decoupled actively by saying, okay, no internet companies, no foreign internet companies, no foreign telecommunication companies, right? No, for the most part, no entertainment companies, right? They've had parts of their economy closed off, sealed off. That's been an active part of their policy. So I think what's surprising to me is that that this model, this offshoring model, lasted as long as it did before we started seeing these things happening. So, what can China do? Zero COVID, not the most intelligent, okay. I don't think zero COVID is doing much good to the Chinese economy, number one. It's not doing much good for investor confidence. The other thing is the crackdown on the tech sector in China has been merciless. And, so they just concluded the investigation on Didi, the ride-sharing app. They ended up paying $1 billion plus fine for endangering national security with the data of customers, Chinese customers. We didn't have a chance to talk about that. That's a big deal, right? Data wars, data geopolitics. I think China will continue to, China's domestic economy will continue to be a very strong magnet for foreign companies. But it's going to be increasingly difficult, and they're going to have to operate in an increasingly insulated environment, an in China, for China environment, which means that they're going to have to compartmentalize their operations. But here's the thing. If China you know, if we wake up tomorrow and a naval vessel has rammed an American ship in the South China Sea or vice versa, right? All of this investment and activity in China could go up in smoke for a lot of companies, right? And a lot of that, especially Wall Street. But you know, I think you know the world's going through a fundamental shift, and there is you know, even though China will remain very attractive for a lot of companies, the way the game is played is now going to be fundamentally different than it was even 5 years ago.
I have a question on supply chain issues. Do you think the global forum like WTO can play a significant role on ensuring supply chain? Recently, an NC12 issue on ensuring food security and pandemic support came in the WTO agenda. So do you think the WTO forum of 164 members that can play a role on ensuring supply chain or food chain?
I think I'll let Steve answer that one since we're almost coming up on the hour. The short answer is no. Multilateralism, I am a believer in multilateralism. Getting 164 countries to agree on anything is pretty difficult, especially when you have to deal with a north-south divide, whether it's on climate change or anything else. I think the WTO obviously still has its place, but if countries want to get something done quickly and efficiently, they're probably going to seek bilaterals or minilaterals, right? And we're seeing that happen with Singapore. Singapore wants to remain a vibrant logistics and commercial and financial and innovation hub, and it's not waiting around. It's signing digital economy agreements with the UK, DEPA, right? It's pairing up, and it's going out of its way to say, we are not going to impose data localization requirements. We're not going to ask you for a code. We're not going to ask you for decryption keys, basically. We're not going to do a lot of these things because we're absolutely going to stay transparent and open. And getting 164 countries to deal with that? No way. Forget it.
Thank you.
And I mean, I'll just say, you know, I'm a great believer in free trade agreements, but you've got, you know, RCEP and you've got CPTPP. I struggle with the idea of actually enforcing the rules of origin in any of these agreements. They have got the most lovely language, and they've got the most lovely ideals, especially the gold standard, right? The deep CPTPP with standards around gender, standards around environmental qualities, carbon footprints, all these other things. Wonderful. That's just great. Good luck trying to validate that. Good luck. Now, if countries actually were to start enforcing that sort of thing, then we didn't get a chance to talk about this either today. But I think the transparency industry is a massive industry on the up, right? Anything that confers supply chain transparency, right, is going to be critically important because you've got carbon issues, you've got labor issues, now you've got sanctions and end user and end use issues, all of those things. I promise you, the world's best run companies have limited visibility in their supply chains. They really, truly do. Because it's hard to do and because it's complex and you don't know who your supplier's supplier is and your supplier's supplier's supplier. So that's another reason why some companies will just say, forget it, I'm localizing. I'm moving my, forget it. I'm not running my supply chain through Pakistan anymore. I've got robots and automation that can do all that stuff. I don't need 50 people in Vietnam putting together a running shoe for me. Has anybody been to a shoe factory in Vietnam lately? I mean, like in the last year or two? I mean, okay, yeah, that's true. All right, so in the last 5 years, right? I mean, go to a Nike shoe factory or an Adidas shoe factory. What? Are you kidding me? There's like, somebody's gluing something on the shoe by hand, passing it down the line, and someone else is slapping something on by hand, then it goes into a heater. I'm thinking, wait a second. Wait, we got 3D printing. How long is this model gonna hold up?
So I want to know about how big is or will be the contribution of climate change or new emergency like pandemic to change countries, like especially for U.S. strategy for cross-border commerce or trade. Because like before the COVID-19, U.S. sanctioned or blacklisted top Malaysian like globe manufacturing company. It's called Top Globe. So after the COVID-19 pandemic, they lifted the ban. To import the like medical gloves companies.
Yeah.
So what do you think? How big is or will be the?
That's a great question, and I'm sorry, I don't want to be pessimistic or anything, but I am very, very skeptical about 1.5 centigrade, by 2050. I think we'll blast through that well before 2050, and I'm sorry, but look at what's happening today with the Ukraine war, right? Energy shortage, supply chain shortages. When there is an existential crisis, we all look after our own needs first, right? And if that means that there's no, you can't turn the lights on next month or you can't turn on the heating next month, decarbonization takes a backseat to obtaining energy. And we're seeing that, of course, right? If that means drilling for more fossil fuels, if it means increasing fossil fuel production, well, that's exactly what's happening in the world today. So it shouldn't come as a surprise then that if during COVID, something that was denied for maybe a political reason, if people are hungry or if they're in need, then that gets waived. And that's what we've seen with decarbonization. Now, I'm a great believer in decarbonization, and I think it's actually, I think there are great economic incentives for decarbonization. But again, if you leave it to the markets, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen, right? Governments have to form the right kind of partnerships. Governments have to pay. They got to step up, and they have to fund, and they have to penalize, and they have to tax, and they have to basically do stuff that's going to alter behavior, because short-term existential issues have to be dealt with. And I do see the world fragmenting around climate change. I mean, look, the North-South divide, if the North doesn't pay and spend a lot of money in the South helping them transition to to a carbon-free environment, it's not going to happen. I mean, the next 20 or 30 years of economic growth are all going to be fueled by coal and fossil fuels. China, India, right? So that is where this paradigm shift becomes so important, because again, the markets aren't going to drive this. It's going to have to come down to governments pushing it, paying for it, punishing the wrong kind of behavior, and encouraging the right kind of partnerships.
Alex, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.